Okay, now let's move on a bit and look at cognitive development and social learning theories from psychology as to how people develop a sense of gender. Again, focusing on early experiences of children, and how that produces a sense of oneself as a boy or a girl, or produces a sense of oneself as someone who exists in a world of boys and girls. So, cognitive development and social learning theories are a lot more empirically based than psychodynamic theories, which is to say that they're based on experimentation. They're based on kind of forward-looking research, designing a research project, and then moving forward with it. While psychodynamic theories were largely based on clinical populations, people who expressed some form of psychological distress or discomfort, and in the process of therapy, counseling, working with them, ideas about gender surfaced and then were theorized or analyzed by the psychiatrist or the analyst involved. So cognitive development comes from a different paradigm from that, from a paradigm that's much more about empirical science. Cognitive development and social learning theories, as I mentioned earlier, are often rolled together, which makes a lot of sense to me, but there are slightly different emphases between them. Essentially, theories or scholarship or work that focuses on cognitive development is really focused on ability, the emerging, evolving ability of a child to make sense out of their world, which is a developmental process, a process of growing up, neurological processes. They're able uh, to perceive and to understand more and more abstract or complex ideas. Cognitive development theory comes um, into the realm of gender when it addresses the question of the emerging understanding or identity of the self. The idea is that children's notions of themselves as individuals, which has many facets, one of those facets is the idea that they are gendered. And historically, cognitive development theory has focused on this sort of gender binary, boys, girls. More recent work is a little more nuanced and looks at the development of a sense of self which is non-binary or which is fluid between the binaries. But most of what the work that has been done so far that we've got to go on is kind of presuming that the gendered self that the child develops is gendered within a two-gender system. Cognitive development theory links into behavior and other aspects of gender through the assumption that children will adopt gendered behaviors. They're often described as traits, though they're not traits in the same sense that a biologist would use the term, in order to achieve self-consistency. And one of the ideas here is that a driving force in psychological development is the desire to be internally consistent. So if I know myself to be X, I'm going to do things that reaffirm and reinforce my sense of myself as X. Cognitive development theorists would say that we don't like internal contradiction. We don't like to identify as one thing and then behave as something different. So children, once they develop this sense of I am whatever gender, they then start observing and adopting for themselves behaviors which their social environment presents as consistent with or desirable for that gender. Part of this internal may be a hardwired drive, who knows, to achieve self-consistency. Social learning is takes a slightly different focus, and it looks at This comes very much out of behaviorism. It looks at the influences of the child's environment, the outside world, on this developing sense of self. So social learning sees the adoption of gendered behaviors and gendered expressions and traits really as a response to forces in the child's immediate environment, whether that's home or family or school or what have you. And it's a pretty simple model of behavior change. Children learn that if they behave in ways that are permissible or encouraged or allowable for their gender, they will be rewarded. The little boy who picks up two trucks and bangs them together, and the parents say, "Oh, he's going to grow up to be a professional truck banger," or something like that. That approval encourages that little boy to continue engaging in this kind of play, and it becomes reinforced over and over again in a positive way. Gender atypical behavior, if you imagine, in a fairly conservative household, the little boy picks up a baby doll and says, "I want to be a mommy when I grow up," and his parents say, "Yeah, maybe not." The child perceives that negative reinforcement, that disapproval, and so reduces behavior which is in their context considered gender atypical. So kids respond to their environment. They reproduce behavior which is approved of, or at least not actively disapproved of, and they reduce or extinguish behavior which they learn from their environment is undesirable or atypical for the gender that they inhabit. This is this should not be taken as gospel also. This is a kind of quick and dirty diagram of for cognitive development social learning theorists looking at early childhood as the time when gender identity and gendered understandings are set. And this is kind of a rough chronology or timeline of when children begin to develop different facets of gender from as this paradigm sees it. So you'll note, and I'll go through the most important ones of these in the next couple of slides. You'll note that it begins really young. Psychologists who work in this tradition are now working with babies, like kids who are pre-verbal, who are only 6 or 8 months old, to determine whether they perceive gender differences in the adults around them, whether they respond differently to adults who present in different gendered ways, and so forth. And the overall message seems to be that gender awareness or perceptions of gender difference in adults goes back very, very young. It's one of the first things, so we learn that that infants show that they see or they understand about their world. A little later come the phases of constancy and stability. I'll say a bit more about those coming up. Around age 3 or age 4, education theorists, psychologists start to note a preference for same gender play among kids, that kids will gravitate towards groups of other children who are the same gender or who are categorized in the same gender. Doesn't mean that that's all they do. It just means that a preference seems to start emerging around that time. There's an interesting period just before puberty, and the psychodynamic theorists also identified this, of what they call latency, or what you could call gender relaxation. And there's this interesting moment before the all of the physiological stuff with puberty that makes physical differentiation much more visible, where kids seem to drop some of the rigidity around play preferences, that they seem to drop some of the differentiation or division of the world into gendered categories. And this is often where you see kids of the same age that are of different genders who are playing together, and they're all pretty good with it. Psychodynamic theorists have a complicated explanation for why this sex difference seems to sort of go underground or disappear for a bit as a motivating force. Cognitive development and social learning theorists don't have a complicated explanation for it. They just note that it happens. And then when puberty comes along and puberty hits, the social pressures to define oneself within a binary gender category, coupled with the intensifying heteronormative pressures to define oneself in terms of sexuality, and often the pressure to at least appear to be oriented, to have a sexual orientation towards people of a different gender, starts to hit around puberty. And that's where we see what some theorists refer to as gender hardening, where boys seem to become much more conscious that they are boys, and then, they're not 9 or 10 years old anymore. They don't want to hang around with girls. Girls seem to develop a stronger consciousness that they are girls, and some of that earlier mixing of the latency period kind of fades away. Obviously, tons and tons of individual variation, and this is not something that naturally inevitably happens. That all these processes are strongly influenced by culture and by social norms. So the processes of social learning that the child goes through to achieve, for instance, gender labeling, the ability to identify people as gendered masculine or gendered feminine; gender stability, the understanding that that genders don't change from one moment to the next. If somebody was a boy one day, they're going to be a boy next day; as well as gender constancy across situations. Girls can't decide they want to be boys for an afternoon and then, switch back to girls again. All of these processes of social learning occur through a few basic mechanisms. One is direct instruction, which is actually probably the least common when it comes to gender. And that's like telling people, okay, you are now a boy. As a boy, you have to do this, this, and this, and you cannot do that, and that. There are some, usually in the context of rituals, where children, like religious or cultural rituals, where children are instructed directly about gender and how to enact gender, but it's probably not the most common process of social learning. Imitation or modeling is a more probably significant process, and that's where kids identify with, they see themselves, well, I'm like my mother, or I'm like my aunt, or I'm like my teacher, and will imitate the behavior of adults or older children, or even other children their own age, who belong to the same category in which that child has placed themselves or been placed. Modeling, you can base yourself on someone that you take as a model. Sometimes it's unconscious. Kids often aren't even aware that they're imitating or modeling behavior. Any parent will recognize those moments when you realize your child is actually imitating you or modeling themselves on you, and you had no idea or intention, and probably the kid didn't either. Modeling and imitation can also work in the form of aversion, where children see something and they understand that they can't be that thing, or they don't want to be that thing. I'm a boy, so I'm going to behave differently from the girls and women around me. It's a kind of negative form of modeling. And this is something that Chodorow, who we spoke of a little while ago, had something to say about too. And then there's reinforcement or in some cases, lack of reinforcement, which I talked about a bit earlier. So children get approval, they get positive attention, they get praise for embodying and enacting the gender category to which they've been assigned. So that, we repeat behavior that gets us positive attention. And in some cases, kids get negative attention, or sanctions, or negative consequences for behavior that is antithetical, or that is different and not in a good way from the behavior associated with the category to which they've been assigned. And kids respond to these positive and negative reinforcement signals. In some situations, where kids may be growing up in a family or a household or a society where gender categories are not strongly policed or monitored, you see more fluidity and more diversity in behavior because kids aren't receiving strong signals that this is for girls, you are a girl, therefore you need to do this, or similar for boys. So the degree of reinforcement for gender is quite variable across a whole lot of contexts. The process of social learning it's never entirely complete, but at some point, nobody knows exactly when, it becomes internalized. So very few 12-year-olds are walking around thinking, okay, I'm a girl going through puberty, and so therefore I do not want to play games with boys anymore. It's now my time to regard boys as objects of sexual desire, or myself as their object, and so now I'm going to embark on that. This is learning which is not at the conscious level, which is internalized to the point where individuals, without even realizing it, monitor themselves. It's almost like they conduct surveillance on themselves to ensure that they are behaving consistently with their gender, without ever realizing, without ever being conscious that they're doing it. So the learning of gender has sunk in so deeply that it's not something that that most people go through their day thinking about in great detail. So where gender difference comes in with social learning, and we're talking about boys, girls here, um, one important thing that's been observed is that while these learning processes, imitation and modeling and reinforcement and so forth, may be the same for boys and girls, their brains work the same way, basically, and so they learn the same way. But the experience of learning gender can be quite different depending on whether you get categorized, you get put in the boy category, you get put in the girl category. And the most important conclusion here, or theme here, is the idea that for boys, gender tends to be more rigidly regulated in the form of the repudiation or distancing from things which are seen to be feminine, or seen to be girly, or seem to be sissy. Got a quote from the writer Robert Stoller: "The first order of business in being a man is don't be a woman." So what a lot of studies have observed is that boys receive a lot more negative sanction for acting girly, for being whatever traits are associated with femininity, being very emotional, crying a lot, not wanting to engage in sort of rough and tumble activities, wanting to play with dolls and so on. They receive a lot more negative reinforcement for that than girls do for taking on, quote unquote, masculine behaviors like wanting to play with trucks, getting really into team sports, being sort of rough and tumble, and so forth. So there's much more leeway for girls behaving in, again, with the air quotes, boyish ways than there is for boys behaving in girl-ish ways. Why this should be so, I mean, there's no explanation that's really rational. One good possibility is that in a gendered society where masculinity is associated with competence, power, authority, resources, prestige, seeking to be that thing or behaving kind of like that hegemonic masculine ideal, it's associated with power and so on, can be viewed as a positive thing. That these are girls and women who are tough or assertive or what have you, and are approaching that sort of hegemonic masculine thing. That's what sociologists would call status elevation. Whereas in a society where the attributes of femininity are not regarded as highly, being, again, with the air quotes, weak or frivolous or overly concerned with appearance or overly emotional, a boy who displays these behaviors or aspires to these things, that's a form of status decline, loss of status, and is stigmatized as such. So in some ways, it's easier for girls and women to display behaviors that are not classically feminine than it is for boys and men to do the same thing. And I have this little experiment that well, not really an experiment, thing that I do when teaching in person with large groups that are mixed gender, like university classes, is I ask all the students who identify as female and say, okay, how many of you would have described yourself as a tomboy when you were a kid? And more than half of them put their hand up. They're quite comfortable claiming that label. Yeah, I was kind of a tomboy when I was a kid, when I was a girl. And then I ask students who identify as male, okay, how many of you would describe yourself as being a sissy when you were a kid? And I get like maybe one or two hands that people raise sort of reluctantly. So there's a lot less willingness to claim that feminized identity of being a sissy boy, as compared to greater willingness to claim, yeah, I was kind of a tomboy. I played with my brothers. I did boys stuff when I was a girl. We elevate, masculine coded or masculine typed activities. And this is one way in which it's manifested, that people are uh, girls, women, people who identify as such are more willing to claim those masculine attributes than boys or men are to claim feminine or feminized ones.